Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
Welcome again here to Capitol Report. I'm David Nicholas, joined again by the editor and publisher of Inside Michigan Politics, Bill Ballenger. We're in essence picking up a conversation that we started. We're coming to you from the fourth floor of the Capitol here in Lansing, a Senate conference room that we've come to the last couple of years to sort of get the overview. So we say welcome back as we now shift our focus to these walls, Lansing's walls, for this half. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Dave.
We sit down literally 2 days before the governor's State of the State address, so we can't do a whole lot of speculation, but that address will have happened by the time our audience joins us. So it's puts us in kind of an awkward position, but I'm wondering, based on some of the things that we saw in the lame duck session, some of the things that at least have been talked about as potential agenda items going into a second term, is there anything monumental that you would see coming out of, maybe something that we didn't expect or a real major initiative, and how it may play out if it's something we are expecting from the governor moving forward as he hands things off to the legislature?
I doubt if we're really going to be surprised by anything this year or next, unless there's some calamity or some development we can't foresee, perhaps at the federal level that might have some fiscal impact on the state we can't foresee. We are going to have a closely watched scenario playing out on the budget anyway, because I think a lot of people are anxious to see whether a lot of the legislation and the budget laws that were passed in the last 2 years start to yield fruit for the state treasury and for the state's economic development for its citizens that the Snyder administration has promised will be forthcoming, because he is, as he puts it, reinventing Michigan. So I think there's going to be a lot of watching and waiting in the next year or two, more than in the last 2 years. I think it's going to be hard to beat the last session of the '96 legislature for sheer accomplishment, both in quantity and in quality. And when I say quality, I'm not implying that it's all positive quality, but it's substantive, one way or another, depending on how you look at what was passed. Really major stuff was done, and it was kind of done in a bookend type scenario, where on the front end in the spring of 2011, in the first 5 or 6 months of the
We were going to move everything ahead in dog years or something. That was the whole, we get everything done and accomplish at lightning speed.
Yeah. They did, or at least they thought they did, or the public thought they did. And then they did kind of, take it easy for 16, 17 months, and not that much happened between June of 2011 and the election this fall. But then came this lame duck session after the November 6th election, and I don't think anybody saw coming what actually happened. Not just right to work, but there was a whole bunch of other legislation that passed at that time.
Was it because of the vote on November 6th?
I think part of it.
Critics stepped forward and said that literally, and they labeled it, and I'll give you a take at this too, that a lot of these things, why don't we wait? Let's go through the legislative process. Why are we rushing it? Well, as critics said, they're not going to have the votes to get them through, so they're doing it this way, and it was a very obviously over-politicized state of several days and weeks down here.
Yeah, well, the critics you describe were Democrats. Those were the critics, and the labor unions and interest groups that were not happy with some of the developments in the lame duck session. And look, a lame duck session is always controversial, because let's face it, the people who are sitting and passing laws in a lame duck session, many of them are not coming back to the legislature after December 31st. They're
more so in the way it played out this time than in other lame duck sessions?
Well, no, not well. Let's put it this way. There were actually fewer lame duck members in this session than there have been in the past, but there were enough to make a difference. And look, let's face it, the Republicans had a 64-46 majority in the House. Now, that is the biggest majority the Republicans have had in the State House of Representatives since just after World War II. We're talking almost 70 years. And they knew that on December 31st, it was going to go poof. They weren't going to have that size of a majority. It was going to be 59-51, which is okay, but it's not 64-46. And they have a 26-12 majority in the Senate. It's better than 2/3 majority. So, you know, they realized, particularly with right to work and a few other bills, if there was ever a time that they were going to make it happen, it had to be in that lame duck session, because they probably wouldn't have the votes after January 1st. There would be enough Republicans in marginal districts sitting in January, February, or any time during in 2013 who would be nervous about voting for right to work or some of these other bills.
Now, the governor said he didn't want right to work brought up in the election year, and seemed to he didn't want that in advance of the election. Maybe we need to qualify that statement.
He didn't get that specific. He just said it's not on my agenda. It was like a broken record. He's been saying for 3 years, it's not on my agenda. But what does that mean, Dave?
Well, what does it mean? Because I can imagine that anybody, if you flipped it, you could probably make the same case. We could be sitting here talking about a similar way that this would have played out if we were talking about Democrats running all of this through as the Republicans did. So that is to say, would this governor be like a governor of another party in saying it's not on my agenda, but was there sort of a nod, a green light, or was this literally something, a wave that came on through the legislature and put it in front of him, basically saying, sign it?
I think it's what you just described, plus it was proposal 2. Remember that? The unions in the Democratic Party decided we are going to put a proposal on the ballot November 6th where we write into the Michigan Constitution a guarantee of collective bargaining and a lot of things that have been on labor's wish list for years, and that might have undone, frankly, a lot of stuff already in state law that labor didn't like. Governor Snyder tried to get the unions not to do this, not to go through with it, said, don't do this. You know, it's very controversial. You know, it's just going to enrage the people who want things like right to work, and they're going to have to spend millions to defeat it. They did. It was defeated. And I think there was a lot of feeling by the business community and people who wanted right to work, and conservatives and Republicans say, hey, you know, the Democrats really brought this on themselves. They put this on the ballot. The people spoke. The people rejected it. We spent millions of dollars defeating this thing. We want a little bit more for our money than just stopping them from doing something we don't like. We want right to work. And I think there was mounting pressure behind the scenes by key people in the Republican Party and in the fundraising community of the Republican Party. And there were some key legislators who'd been restrained for 2 years from advancing right-to-work legislation and some other things on the grounds that Snyder really didn't want this put before him. But after November 6th, they decided, you know what, why are we playing nice guy here all the time? Let's push this thing. Snyder never has said that if something actually passed the legislature, he would not sign it. So they passed it, and he actually came out the day before the vote, the key vote, and said, okay, kumbaya, we're gonna, you know, join hands together and go off the cliff together and support this and put it behind us. One way or another, this is gonna get done. I think Governor Snyder decided, frankly, this thing is never going to go away. It's going to linger around. People are going to be asking me next year, what about right to work? And I want to get this thing off the table. And I think he tried to sell it on the grounds that, look, Indiana has passed it. They're right next door. This is a very competitive business environment in a global economy, and Michigan shouldn't be at a disadvantage in trying to woo manufacturers to the state. who have been reluctant or resistant to come here because they know we're a very strong union state. So let's, get everything on an even playing field.
Does our bill do that? The bill that passed, does it do that? Or when we look at all the factors that make up states are obviously unique entities. So are factors in place in Indiana that differ them from us? So is it a quote-unquote level playing field, which those that supported right to work said is what they wanted?
Well, I think there will be litigation. I think probably the labor unions and the Democrats will file suits in court challenging specific aspects of the law, and we'll have to see whether it holds up. I think the Republicans feel pretty strongly that the law is well written and it will hold up. But look, the bottom line is it going to produce jobs in Michigan? I mean, that's what they're selling it as doing. They're saying this makes a much more friendly business environment. What the Republicans need is they need a few manufacturers to come into Michigan and hold press conferences saying, hey, we're fired up. We're moving here because you passed a right to work law. That's what they need. And they probably need some manufacturers in Michigan who are ready to move to say, we're not going to move because we've got a right to work law or whatever. That's what they need. Will they get it? That's the real question. I mean, if we're sitting here 3, 4, 5 years from now and there isn't any evidence that there's been any economic development in Michigan whatsoever as a result of passage of right to work, and in fact, perhaps there is some evidence that wages have gone down proportionately or are not keeping pace with other states, and the unions could say, well, what do we tell you? This is because this is what happens when you pass right to work. I don't think that's going to be good for the Republicans.
Overall, then, I mean, you mentioned court challenge likely for something like this. For that unbelievably long list of what got passed, Democrats don't have a majority in either. They, as you said, narrow the margin in the House. Is it going to happen within these chambers or more in the courts where any of this long list or range or clusters of things that come under any particular umbrella get challenged? I mean, what survives, what doesn't out of what got passed? Or is all of this really a fast forward to the campaign ads already being written for 2014 across the board of obviously, Democrats opposing what?
Well, if you're asking whether stuff that was accomplished in lame duck or earlier in 2011 is going to be repealed or rolled back, it ain't going to happen, okay, at least in the short term. No. I mean, the idea that somehow Republicans are going to be browbeaten into worrying that there's a backlash against them from having done this, no, it's not going to happen. Now, one thing that was vetoed by the governor, strangely enough, as a result of the lame duck session was a Blue Cross Blue Shield reform bill, which the Snyder administration wanted and had pushed, and everybody had agreed to. But at the last minute, it got language added to it, a clause on abortion coverage in a separate rider that Snyder claimed was objectionable, and he vetoed the bill on that basis. So everybody agrees, at least on the Republican side. Now, here's a real question about how the Democrats feel about this, that they're going to have to redo this, and they're going to have to pass the bill again without this abortion language in it. And so that's something, it's an unfinished piece of business. But I think going forward, you're looking at different issues than what was taken up and enacted in the last 2 years.
Do people like new House Minority Leader Greimel and continuing the Senate, the Minority Leader Whitmer, do they have any more? They don't have votes to back them up, but do they, because of the contentious nature of this, do they gain any traction? Do they gain any clout in terms of how things are carried out here in Lansing? Because of, again, the contentious nature, and the majority is still there, but do they have themselves elevated at all because of public perception or support behind them?
Yeah.
Anything of that
well,
nature? I
would just say this. You got a different situation, I think, in the House and the Senate in terms of leadership. The new Democratic leader in the House is really kind of an extraordinary figure in the sense that he was elected in a special election last February 28th, less than a year ago, to fill a vacant seat. And so he was only in the House for about 9 months when his colleagues chose him to be their leader for the next, it could be 5.5 years. And his name is Tim Greimel. He's from the Pontiac area. He'd been an Oakland County commissioner. He just doesn't have much history here, and he hasn't had time to make enemies or pick up a lot of baggage. And he's shown a willingness to try and work with the Republican leadership of the House going forward. There was some debate over whether the Democrats were going to oppose the re-election of Speaker Jace Bolger, who is under scrutiny by a one-woman grand jury right now because of shenanigans last spring involving a party switch by a member. And ultimately, the House Democrats in Greimel said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be hostile and confrontational. We'll all vote to re-elect Jace Bolger. It wouldn't have made any difference if they voted against him because Republicans had, majority of the votes, but it would have been symbolic because traditionally the minority always supports whoever the majority picks to be the speaker, going way back, almost half a century. Now, over in the Senate, totally different situation. Gretchen Whitmer is the Senate Democratic leader. She may be getting ready to run for governor herself.
Anybody I talk to say that she is.
Okay,
so.
Or maybe Attorney General. She was speculated about for that back in 2010. We don't know. But she has been a real aggressive flamethrower as a Senate Democratic leader, more so than any I've ever seen in nearly half a century covering the Capitol. So much so that she's really kind of taken herself out of being a player in negotiations between the House and Senate and between the Democrats and Republicans, because she has been so aggressively negative toward the Republicans, particularly the Speaker of the House. She's not even a member of the House, and yet she was the one who was the most outspoken against Jace Bolger. So you've got a very different situations. She's term limited. She can't run again after 2014 for the Senate. So she may be running for something else, and we'll just have to see what's going to happen going forward. But frankly, the only person I can see who has heightened clout compared to his predecessor is Tim Greimel, because the Democrats' minority status is more robust than Richard Hamill, the Democratic leader, had in the House the last 2 years. Instead of 64-46, it's only 59-51. And Greimel is a sharp guy. He's a lawyer, a labor lawyer, and he's trying to play nice and get some cooperation. Let's see what happens.
You mentioned his being brought to Lansing through a special election. There was the recall that, although it did not flip parties, of Paul Scott. There was the attempted recall of the governor that was in play for a while. There was the attempted recall and obviously the ongoing antagonistic nature of Speaker Bolger. Legislation that's coming out is in the early days of this session is dealing with how recalls are being done. Will we see more of that? And I also bring up a comment that you made after the election where you talked about the amount of resources that the Democrats spent in going after Paul Scott, in going after Jace Bolger. Could they have potentially won enough seats to take control of the House if resources had been spread more evenly? So the landscape in the future for this type of politics being done.
Okay, very quickly, I don't think the recall of Paul Scott, which happened in the fall of 2011, so we're talking maybe 15 months ago, had any real impact on who controlled the House, because the Republicans ended up winning the seat. When they had a special election after Paul Scott was recalled, they ended up winning a seat anyway. It was a total waste of time, a total waste of money, and frankly, it backfired probably on the Michigan Education Association, who were really behind that recall, because the Republicans passed a lot of legislation that was inimical to the interests of the MEA, because the Republicans were resentful of what the MEA had done. I think in the legislature there is little stomach for recalls. I don't think the Democrats are calling for recalls. You mentioned changing the recall law. That was something that was done in the lame duck session by the Republicans primarily, and the Republicans basically made it a lot tougher to recall people from going forward. It's going to be a lot tougher. I just don't think you're going to see that be a big factor. And I don't think it was a big factor in control of the House at any point. I think what may have been a factor was that the Democrats may have spent, nobody knows for sure, anywhere from $500,000 to $750,000 down in the Marshall area in Calhoun County trying to defeat Jace Bolger, the Republican Speaker of the House, because of his problems with the party switch of a state representative from Grand Rapids last spring, and they failed. And Jace Bolger, even though his margin was pretty skimpy, it was only 800 and some votes, he won. There's that old saying, if you strike at the king, you better kill him. And they didn't kill him. So he's back in the saddle as Speaker. And a lot of people say, hey, what if they just taken that $500,000 and spread it around 5 or 6 other districts where the Democrats lost narrowly? They might have gotten control of the House. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but it's history at this point.
So political capital, Democrats spent a lot of money doing that and maybe lost a chance, at least this time, to gain control of the House. Republicans passed an awful lot of stuff through in the lame duck that could, in terms of the perception or the campaigns or the court challenges, whatever, come back to roost by 2014. Does either side, did they use up too much of, and when we look at that then in terms of what gets done, we've already talked about the majorities that are still there and the governor having an agenda moving forward, but is anybody at risk of having used too much of their capital during what has been a rather rocky year that we've just come out of?
Well, 2 things. Number one, we've already had some kind of a referendum on what the Republicans did, not in the lame duck, but earlier in the last session, in November 6th, in the general election, and the Republicans have still got the majority, 59-51, okay? Now, on the other hand, a lot of the tax changes that were put into effect by the Republicans are really not going to be felt until this year, because they really involve the 2012 tax year, and people are going to be filing their returns this spring. So let's see how the public reacts when they pay their taxes in April and going forward during 2013 about a lot of the tax changes, like the tax on pensions, which was very controversial and which the Democrats campaigned against in the fall and will campaign against in 2014, and which a lot of Republicans are very nervous about. But, you know, if the economy turns around, or let's put it this way, if it takes off, I mean, it is improving marginally right now, but it's pretty tepid. If it really starts to get robust in recovery, and if the Republicans and Governor Snyder in 2014 can claim, you know, we did a lot of painful, controversial stuff back in 2011, 2012 that people may not have liked, but we had to do it to get our fiscal house in order, and what we did really makes sense going forward, and it's led to improvement that everybody can see, and we're getting a payoff now. That's what the Republicans want to see happen. But if it doesn't happen, Dave, if the Democrats in 2014 can say, you know, we told you back in 2011, 2012, all the Republicans were doing was giving some huge tax break to business, $2 billion. In fact, it's more than that now, because another thing that they enacted in lame duck was personal property tax relief, with another $1 billion in relief. And what do we got to show for it? We're not going anywhere. This economy is languishing. We haven't been reinvented. It's all a charade, a canard. It's a hoax. The Republicans have pulled the wool over your eyes.
Canard and a hoax and war.
Everything, everything. I mean, they're just going to be tied in knots, you know? That's what the Democrats will be claiming, if that's the way things are, and that'll make it tough for Republicans in the fall of 2014.
In our last minute and a half, then one last look at the politics here in Lansing, or at least the workings of government here. Michigan Supreme Court and the resignation of Justice Hathaway amidst all that has been going on there. Does that long-term, short-term, in terms of the number of cases that are potentially coming before the court, anything change in the way we will see as a major impact of the change now coming to that seat?
Here's the major impact. It makes it almost impossible for the Republicans to lose control of the court in the 2014 election. There are going to be 3 seats up again in 2014 out of the 7, just like there were in 2012. Democrats would have to run the table, win all 3 seats in 2014 to get control of the court, and then it would only be by a narrow 4-3 margin. That ain't going to happen. The Democrats only won 1 of the 3 seats this past November 6th in a very good year for Democrats. And I don't think that they can run the table in 2014, particularly when 2 of the 3 seats that are going to be up are going to be held by Republican incumbents with the incumbency designation on the ballot. All the Republicans have to do is win 1 of those 3 seats, and they will still control the court. If they win 2, they'll have the same 5-2 majority. That's what the resignation of Justice Hathaway does. It gives Governor Snyder the power to appoint a Republican conservative replacement that will expand the Republicans' margin from 4-3 to 5-2 and make it almost impossible for the Democrats to regain control in 2014.
So we'll watch that for a few blocks from here, and we'll certainly watch everything that happens not only in this Senate conference room, but all places here inside the Capitol. Thanks again for giving us the overview of what took place in November and then looking forward into a new legislative term. As always, good to spend the time with you, and thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Dave.
Our guest has been Bill Ballenger, Inside Politics editor and publisher, and we thank again the Office of State Senator Judy Emmons for arranging us to have this space here to come to you again to open yet another season of Capitol Report. Our thanks to everyone at CMU Public Television for making the arrangements as well for us to be able to come to you from Lansing this time around. I'm David Nicholas. Thanks. Welcome to our new season, and we'll continue these talks on down the road.
You've been watching Capitol Report. Join us again as your elected officials speak to your concerns on current issues.